Hello friends, today we are going to see the macro in assembly language programming. All of you are using NetWise assembler to assemble your program. You are doing the 64-bit programming, means for the 64-bit Intel processor programming on your host machine. Let us begin with how and when we can use this macro definition in a program so that our program becomes more simplified and more code use is possible in our program. Let us begin with the macro. So what exactly the macro is? Very first, the macro makes your program modular. Modular means you can make your program in parts and you can reuse those parts at the various levels in your program. With the help of such macros, your program becomes more simplified. As the program becomes more simplified, so your program is readable. And the macro avoids the repetition in line code as it as more use of the code is done in your programming, so the length of your program is also get shortened. Macro is nothing but a small sequence of instruction. It is not like as the procedure, where the execution of the procedure and the execution of the macro is different. When we use the macro is defined with a name and it gets called in your program with the name only. In assembled macro name and the parameter replaced code enclosed in the macro definition. When you write a definition of the macro, a block of code is used over there. Use the macro only at that place where the repetitive code is so small. That's why it terms as inline code. You are define the macro in its specific definition and it gets called in your program with its name only. Now we'll see how the macro is defined in your program. Macro is always defined with %macro and %end macro assembler directives. Macro is called with the parameter in sequence. So whatever the number of parameters are there, those are defined in your macro definition. As shown here, the definition of the macro where you get the macro name is start with the %macro and here the name appears. And the next is the number of parameters you're passing into this macro. This means that you're using the several parameters which gets called with the macro. Here the call of the macro is shown. Here the macro is defined with the sysread and the two parameters are passed in this macro. And the macro is end with this end macro. Here when the macro is called, the sysread number and 2 is the parameter. So 2 parameter is used when macro gets called. It is the definition where these two parameters gets called in the program. Now each parameter is called in macro definition with the percent and the parameter number which is already been shown. Here we will see one example in which macro sysread is there. So here we have a block of code in which